On the 14th of October 2024, SpaceX launched the first successful booster to have landed back at the launch tower via chopsticks on its first try. What used to be a dream in sci-fi movies just 5 years ago is now a reality. This places the United States towards the goal of going to Mars and establishing permanent settlements on other planetary bodies. This is, in fact, just the latest achievement of SpaceX and Elon Musk. Starlink, and of course by extension, the United States, now owns and operates the majority of satellites in space. Elon Musk's Tesla is also a pioneer of autonomous vehicles and has the largest market share of EVs in the world. But Musk is only the tip of the iceberg of America's dominance in innovation and entrepreneurship. Startup culture is huge in the States, with the United States far outstripping any other nation in the number of unicorns it has. Moreover, the USA headquarters most of the world's largest and most innovative companies, from Apple, Google, Meta, Windows, and many more. It also leads in AI, giving it a head start way ahead of any rivals, including the Chinese. America has huge cultural exports, from Hollywood to pop stars like Taylor Swift, Selena Gomez, or Tommy Richmond, and social media influencers like Jake Paul and Mr. Beast. But it is not just technology or soft power. America also has the world's reserve currency, has more than a quarter of the world's economy, is in multiple strategic alliances from NATO, the Quad, the Five Eyes, and is a geopolitical superpower with the most powerful military. And to many freedom-loving individuals, it is the leader of the free world. Other countries must be jealous of the aforementioned achievements, whether in technology, military, economic clout, and soft power. But of course, America is not the only game in town. On the 19th of September 2024, the New York Times published an article noting that the Hungarian city of Szeged is constructing a BYD factory to avoid EU tariffs on Chinese cars. Mind you, BYD is a Chinese company, and Hungary is emblematic of the extent of Chinese influence worldwide, as Hungary is the first European member of the Belt and Road Initiative. Hungary also has half of Europe's Chinese foreign direct investments and has resisted the push to tariff Chinese EVs. There is a huge probability that you are reading that news on TikTok, or at least your children, if you have any. They are probably doing all sorts of weird trends with allegations that the Chinese government is deliberately pushing brain rot into Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And if you think that you're in the older generation and it's not tainted by Chinese brain rot and Chinese apps, think again, because China now has a cheaper version of Amazon like Temu, which is accused by some for undermining millions of smaller businesses. Simply put, all of the case studies provided before will be unthinkable just 10 years ago, let alone 20. China is now a superpower, the second most powerful nation in the world, only behind the United States. China has massive innovation as well, and it does not just steal or copy Western technologies like in the old days. Aside from software apps like TikTok and Temu, there's also Huawei, BYD, and most incredibly, drones from DJI. And isolating China will not be as easy like the West had done to the Soviet Union. Most of the countries worldwide trade with China more so than both Europe and the USA. And China finances a lot of infrastructure projects, especially in Africa or Southeast Asia, proving its sphere of influence in a lot of the third world. China has the largest manufacturing prowess, especially in shipbuilding and steel, which contributes to its high GDP in purchasing power parity terms. If one wants to observe the rise of China, one can simply admire the Shenzhen or Shanghai skylines. In 1976, Shenzhen was a sleepy fishing village, and Shanghai was a metropolis that seemed to have lost its former glory. But since the 2000s, both cities have grown into their present glory. Shenzhen is now a major tech hub, a Chinese version of Silicon Valley, and Shanghai now has massive skyscrapers, taller than those even in the United States. But what about the EU, or the European continent more generally? Here, I will include all the countries in the European Union, European countries not in the EU, like Norway and the UK, and also Russia, with its huge historical interminglings with European civilization, whether during the antagonistic or friendly phases. Does the European continent stand on par with the American and Chinese superpowers? Sadly, it seemed to have lost its prowess, at least in relative terms. Back in 1900, all of the world's great powers were located in Europe, except America and Imperial Japan. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world, its navy dominating the seas. France occupied massive swaths of Africa. Russia was rapidly industrializing, and Germany was a rising power, threatening the British world order. It has been said that 97% of inventions since the 14th century came from a small patch in Western Europe and Germany. But in 2024, France had lost its influences in Africa to Russia and is facing civil strife in New Caledonia. The UK is giving up the Chagos Islands, and Germany is facing deindustrialization due to higher energy costs, the fallout from over-reliance on Russian energy, and a second China shock due to China's massive EV exports via overproduction. A lot of major European countries still had not recovered economically from the 2008 financial crisis, with a lot of them stagnating like Japan. Italy's GDP in 2022 was lower than in 2007, and to this day, both the UK and the Eurozone suffers from a productivity crisis. Meanwhile, the US has left other wealthy nations economically in the dust, with her GDP now 60% of the G7 compared to just 40% in 1990. In fact, America actually has a higher share of the world's GDP in 2024 with 26.3% than in 1980 with 25.4%. And China seems to have replaced a lot of Europe's former strengths, especially in innovation and economic might. By contrast, the European Union went from 28.6% of the world's economy in 1980 to 17.3% today. Moreover, where are Europe's versions of America's iPhone or Chinese Huawei, or America's Amazon or Chinese Shein? It is a problem when the most valuable French or Italian brands are all luxury items. And aside from Sweden's Spotify, Most European startups had migrated to the USA, which the EU recognizes as a conundrum for European competitiveness on the world stage. It is true that Europe still has big corporations like Mercedes, Shell, or Aldi, or billionaires like Bernard Arnault. However, most of those corporations were founded many years ago compared to the number of relative newcomers in the States. But why is this the case? How did Europe go from being the center of everything in 1900 to relative backwater in 2024? Most commentators always place the cutoff at the 2008 financial crisis and rarely go before it. However, the decline happened way before 2008, and a recession simply had made the decline more apparent to the layman observer. The world wars played a huge role in European decline, which led to the massive reverberations that may not have been apparent back then. The mass deaths in both world wars ended the huge nationalistic sentiments in Europe pre-war and led to a rise in occupophobic and pacifist sentiments. France, for example, lost 1.3 million men, or 16% of their male population, in World War I, and Britain lost almost 900,000, or 6% of their adult male population. The huge number of losses also impacted future population growth. The Soviet Union lost 22.8% of 20 to 34-year-olds and 17.9% of 35 to 49-year-olds, which is a lot of the prime working age demographic needed for economic growth and production. The Soviet Union never recovered its pre-World War II birth rate, which was half post-war by 1959, despite being above replacement rate at the time. Now Russia is considered a dying nation by many demographers. If World War II never happened, there would still be a lot of problems in Russia today. But the tragic effects would have been lessened and more moderate. Germany has also been massively impacted by the mass death of the world wars. Almost 2 million and 5 million German soldiers died in World War I and World War II respectively, which means that a lot of young men never saw the miracle on the Rhine post-war and were unable to contribute to the subsequent baby boom. If the two world wars had not occurred, Germany's population would be far higher than it is today. And if Europe would face declines by the 21st century anyway, it would have weathered the storm better due to a larger working age population than in our timeline. Meanwhile, the USA lost relatively few people from both world wars, and today still has a higher birth rate than most European nations. And while China has a population crisis worse than Europe's, and faced the same, if not worse, evils during the Second World War, she at least wins in the numbers game. China's Gen Z and Gen Alpha are larger than a lot of developed nations' populations. The world wars contributed to the growth of utopian ideologies that hampered Europe's ability to project its power medium and long term. The most notable of those were Nazism and communism. Both portrayed themselves as solutions to all the world's ills, especially with the early 20th century facing mass death, wars, economic depressions, technological changes, hypernationalism, and criticisms of cultural decadence in the cities. While France resorted to extreme pacifist sentiments, and the British had their appeasement mindset in the 1930s, Germany opted for National Socialism. Nazism, a form of racial socialism, seeks to gather all Germans into one single political entity and to defend against foreign enemies like the Slavs and the Jews, seeking to what its adherents saw as diluting German blood and culture. Lebensraum and revenge for the Treaty of Versailles was needed to regain German strength. Communism also proved to be popular, especially if one opposes the free market and supposed inequalities and American imperialism. While a lot of Eastern Europe had relatively recovered from Soviet imposed communism, Eastern Europeans lag in economic and population terms behind its Western counterparts, mostly comes from the failure of central planning that communism brought, and the impacts of its collapse after 1989. But there were other idealists post-war who wanted to avoid all great power ambitions and live in a European Union where everyone freely trades, borders get eliminated, and everyone lives in peace. This is understandable, considering the extreme chauvinism of all the great powers in the First World War, and German Nazism contributing to World War II and the Holocaust. While some of the pacifism was created at gunpoint because of fears over German militarism, most of it was a reaction against the traumatic 20th century. This, however, was a miscalculation, as the continent became over-reliant on American security guarantees, which every president since Dwight Eisenhower has complained about. And as a result, Europe, or at least the western half of it, refuses to project any hard power and decides to place comfort as its highest pursuit over all others. They see a need for cheaper gas. Oh wait, there's global warming. Oh wow, we don't need to blame ourselves anymore since we now trade with Russia. At least the blame for greenhouse gases would be now on them. What about the need for consumers, since our continent has a demographic crisis, especially with the shrinking or stagnant populations of Italy, Germany, or Spain? Why not expand trade with China? Just observe Germany's continued expansion of its direct investments into the Middle Kingdom, in spite of tensions between the US and China, a potential invasion of Taiwan, and China's alliances with Russia. With the possible exceptions of the Baltic states and Poland, and maybe a few Scandinavian countries in standing up to Russia. Overall, Europe's attempts to block Russian gas and to deter the Russians had failed. Austria actually increased its gas exports from Russia from 80% to 98% over the past 2 years. And while Italy banned direct exports, it of course still gets Russian gas from Austria. And as a result of war shock and guilt of their imperial past, any attempt to reassert its power, like expanding its own resources via fracking, or rearming its military, will be seen as chauvinistic. Interestingly, even the adherents for a more active European Union foreign policy and an independent European Union identity seem to only define themselves by what they are not, whether the United States or the Middle East/the Third World. A lot of its advocates only talk the walk, but not walk the talk. Many may criticize American foreign policy for its assertiveness, but there is a reason why it is the top dog in international affairs. And on the domestic front, America's Constitution is also simplistic in defining how the United States should function, rather than the idealistic nature of the European Union. China, during its current iteration after 1949, does have its ideologue years, but during the Deng, Jiang, and Hu years, China just wants to get rich and bide its time to grow. European institutions, however, are relatively out of touch, and also esoteric to the layman's individual. The prioritization for comfort post-Second World War not only has a consequence on its hard power capacities, but created the current bloated European welfare state. Now, there is nothing wrong with government assistance or universal healthcare. Countries like South Korea have decent innovation, yet also a generous social safety net. However, most Western European nations' social welfare programs are unsustainable especially in its current crisis, where more money is being spent than is being brought in with revenue. With the exception of Macron's 2022 pension reform, most of Europe still seems to be sleeping. Germany is failing to reform its pensions, and a lot on the UK right are actively complaining about the Labour government removing of the winter fuel allowance. This is even though a lot of those receiving them are wealthy living in large houses, where even the Tory ads prove my point. A 4-day work week is actively gaining popularity among European nations, with Belgium being the first country to legislate one for employees who want it, and some Spanish cities are actively considering it. This is while Europe struggles with economic stagnation and the gap with the US in GDP per capita in both nominal and purchasing power parity terms, real disposable incomes, and worker productivity has widened. And if one does not have a work ethic, other countries that do, that are in Asia or the Anglosphere, will outcompete ones that do not just in economic metrics, but it trickles up towards innovation and entrepreneurship. This is why only 4 out of 50 of the world's top tech companies by market cap are European, while American and Asian ones dominate the rest. China does not have an effective or generous social safety net. Ironic for a communist nation founded to uplift the peasants. However, the Chinese people, both inside and outside of China, are very industrious individuals who can work long hours for low wages to provide for themselves and their families. Most of the world does not have a generous European-style social safety net because they cannot afford it, nor do those nations has any tolerance towards comfort as an end in itself. While many from Europe criticize the relative lack of social programs in the United States, at least the US can compensate for that deficit for its innovation, can-do attitude, high living standards, high wages, and their huge consumption habit in foods, goods, and services. The dopamine for comfort and Europe's guilt to reassert itself in the 21st century requires higher taxes and more regulation on private businesses to appease the unions and workers. A major reason for European startups often leaving for the States is the relative lack of private capital investment when compared to America. For example, the B2B software unicorn Algolia moved its headquarters to San Francisco in 2014 to participate in the Y Combinator Acceleration Program. And a lot of EU companies agree with my worldview, with 60% of those companies saying that regulations are an obstacle to investment. To be fair, one cannot blame them by just looking at the Hinkley Point C case study, where a nuclear plant cannot be built or at least be delayed until 2031 due to a supposed threat to fish on a coastline where the plant will be based. As a result of countries like France flirting with wealth taxes throughout its recent history, especially one by former French President François Hollande in 2012, money that would have remained in the hands of the wealthy will be allocated more so to boost French and European competitiveness on the world stage. The US also has a smaller total tax revenue as a share of GDP compared to every European nation in the OECD in 2021, except for Ireland. While it is true that many European nations have better workers' rights and a higher quality of life than everywhere on Earth, it seems that this is done as an end rather than as a means in itself. To defend one's nation or a political entity like the EU, one must be willing to assert itself in global affairs via military spending, a more hawkish foreign policy, and enable entrepreneurship to convince small nations to purchase European brands rather than go with the Chinese Belt and Road or American AI companies. The revenue from potential companies that are more on par with Asian or American ones will rake in more money than current taxation or quantitative easing. And even reducing taxation may not be enough. European green policies and the need to please Greta Thunberg's ego ends national stability more so than climate change ever will. Due to fears over nuclear power, Germany shut down most of its plants under Merkel, with some even closing just prior and even after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The decision, of course, was paid by the consumers. A study by the OECD found that electricity prices in Germany increased by 34% from 2006 to 2017 for households. Aside from being hooked on Russian pipelines and gas, Germany already has decided to reopen coal-fired generation in order to make up their energy deficit, even though coal is much dirtier and less eco-friendly than nuclear. And some of the whole climate push might even be an attempt of an active measure by Russia. The UK has also idiotic energy policies, with the UK banning fracking while signing pledges with America to export more energy. I mean, why not just get your energy sources here at home when Europe has just as much oil under our feet as America or most of the world? By contrast, everybody else knows saving the world as an ends in itself, or at least without considering the economic and geopolitical costs, is a disaster. China is still building and consuming huge loads of coal in spite of the propaganda that she is a climate leader. And in spite of Biden's anti-fracking stance, private fracking companies are utilizing America's bedrock oil reserves, which were unthinkable just 20 years prior, where it used to rely more so on OPEC. As recently as 2003, America was importing 63% of its oil. Now it is the largest oil producer. Then again, it is an anomaly for Europe to outpace most of the world, which is possibly only a 15th to mid-20th century possibility. There is a reason why they call it the Great Divergence, especially with the impact of the Industrial Revolution making Europe wealthier and more technologically advanced than the rest of the world. European nations went out to conquer every overseas continent, with most not sparing European global domination. However, it is impossible for Europe to dominate forever, especially with most of the world, with Africa and the Middle East outpacing Europe in their population growth and in absolute numbers by the turn of the third millennium. Ironically, the outpacing is done due to Western tech and science, improving life expectancy and infant mortality that allowed massive population growth in the third world. The USA gained its independence in 1776 and was no longer part of European civilization by 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, ending the American Revolutionary War, and America gaining de jure independence from the British Empire. Because the rest of the world caught up in its population, technological, geopolitical, and ideological terms, plus, of course, the two world wars distracting the major powers from the rest of the world, it would be harder for the European colonial empires to hold control of their colonies. Prior to the Great Divergence, which was most of recorded history, China and India combined held around 60 to 70% of the world economy. And while I do not think both countries will return to their historical place on the world stage due to their respective problems, China, for example, seems to be going through huge economic turmoil in the 2020s, especially in its demographics, consumer spending, openness to the world or lack thereof, American sanctions, youth unemployment, and of course the ongoing property bubble. This makes it unlikely, if not impossible, for her to dislodge the USA from its premier place, short of a black swan event like it winning a Third World War over Taiwan, or America having a Great Depression-style economic crisis. And while India is a rising power, it still faces immense issues in its infrastructure, hygiene, education system, national stability, and brain drain to the West. Nevertheless, power has been shifting away from Europe since the early 20th century, with the rise of America, and then later with the rise of countries like Japan, South Korea, China, and maybe also India. To give you context, as recently as 1997, during the handover of Hong Kong, the British GDP was larger than both China and India combined. But since 2021, India's economy has overtaken Britain, and of course China is now rivaling the United States in its growth and share of the world's economy. To clarify, the European continent is still an important part of the world economy. The EU in 2024 still has a higher GDP in nominal terms than China. In terms of the quality of life, European nations beat most of the world in life expectancy, health of its citizens, and life satisfaction. One can simply observe the UN's HDI rankings for this. While its startups and tech firms may not be as dominant as the American ones, a lot of its legacy companies, like its cars and domestic manufacturing like steel, either outperform American ones or perform better on a per capita level. And on a quality level, European products outshine every nation around the world. While China may manufacture the most products, its quality control is subpar, as shown by the number of complaints about its BYDs exploding, or the latest Huawei trifold failing, only after a short period of time. A lot of Western European nations, on the federal level, are more stable than the USA. I mean, the US has at least 2 assassination attempts on a major presidential candidate in the last few months. And the events surrounding January 6 were not pretty, to say the least. Meanwhile, most countries in Europe have a successful and stable transfer of power when compared to the USA since the year 2000s, via Bush versus Gore. And for all of my complaints about European nations not defending themselves, a lot of Eastern Europe and the Scandinavian countries actually have a higher level of citizens willing to die for their nations than the USA. With that being said, in order to defend Europe's achievements, Europe must be willing to create more capital to subsidize their welfare state, and to beef up their militaries to defend their liberal democratic way of life, especially with the United States shifting towards the Middle East and Asia in recent years. It should not be over strangling itself with red tape, mandating internet users to click agree or disagree on the box to comply with the EU's General Data Protection Regulation law, or forcing Elon Musk or Apple to pay taxes to comply with unnecessary or over-exaggerated bureaucratic edicts. A lot of Europe took their stability since the end of the Second World War for granted, and there are signs it may be coming to an end. Europe must prepare accordingly.